In early 2025, Vladimir Putin believed his strategy was perfectly set to deprive Ukraine of NATO's backing, or at a minimum, the support of its most powerful member, the United States. Hints were coming from U.S. President Donald Trump that America might exit NATO. On several occasions, he also laid the blame on Ukraine for initiating the conflict with Russia. Putin's plan appeared to be unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. What a change 9.5 months can make. Putin's rejection of peace terms has driven the U.S. straight back to its NATO allies, and at this point, NATO is fully committed to Ukraine's cause. Russia is unlikely to withstand what's on the horizon, as Ukraine is set to receive all the resources it requires to push back. This was highlighted on October 15th, when NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte addressed a press conference after a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council. At the event, Rutte informed the press that more than half of NATO's member states had pledged support for the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List (PEARL) program, an initiative created to channel aid directly to Ukraine. Through this framework, NATO allies contribute funds that Ukraine can then use to buy the particular American-made armaments it deems necessary to inflict the greatest possible harm on Putin's invading military. This seemingly minor adjustment to how military aid is delivered is a game-changer for Ukraine. While certain limitations are in place, for example, the U.S. won't be selling F-35s to Ukraine in the near future, PEARL signifies that Ukraine is no longer dependent on whatever surplus equipment its partners can offer. Instead, Ukraine has the freedom to select the specific items it requires, as PEARL enables NATO allies to contribute to a shared fund that Ukraine can draw from as necessary. Returning to Rutte's statements, he revealed to journalists that the count of NATO allies participating in PEARL had grown from an initial 6 to over half. With NATO comprising 32 member countries, this indicates that more than 16 nations are now involved. The detail to note is that Rutte did not specify which members were participating by name. This may not have been necessary, however, as a number of NATO countries had already made public their plans to join PEARL prior to his formal announcement. Also on October 15th, NATO's most recent additions, Finland and Sweden, declared their readiness to purchase U.S. armaments via the PURL program to aid Ukraine. These two nations became NATO members amidst the war in Ukraine, concluding decades of relative neutrality for both, and are now committed to doing all they can to assist Ukraine in holding Russia back. ABC News has reported on statements from key ministers in both the Finnish and Swedish governments. Finland's defense minister, Antti Häkkänen, said that Finland had decided to join the PEARL because we see that it's crucial that Ukraine gets the critical U.S. weapons. Notably, Häkkänen also pointed out that Finland would provide military assistance outside of the PURL framework, meaning Ukraine is set to receive Finnish weaponry, in addition to what it can purchase from the U.S. with Finland's financial help. Paul Jansson, Häkkänen's Swedish equivalent, shared similar sentiments. This is critical now because we've been seeing the wrong trajectory when it comes to support to Ukraine, that it's been going down and we want to see more stepping up, Jansson remarked. The Swedish defense minister was alluding to recent accounts of a significant drop in military aid to Ukraine, a topic we will delve into more deeply later on. This confirms that Finland and Sweden are part of the group of more than 16 nations. Several other contributors have also been confirmed, as Newsweek pointed out in its coverage of Rutte's PEARL announcement. The publication reports that Ukraine itself has named several other PEARL participants, such as Iceland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. These nations will be contributing to the 5th and 6th PEARL packages set to be delivered to Ukraine. As you'll learn shortly, these are all recent members. You might, however, observe a notable absence of some of Europe's main military powers, including France, Germany, and the UK. Among those three, Germany is a participant. The country announced back in August that it would finance a $500 million PEARL package for Ukraine, which made it one of the very first contributors to the program. This also implies that one of the 6 nations just listed is not from the original group of 6 but is instead part of the expanded list of 16+. Regarding France and the UK, NATO's other 2 nuclear-armed states besides the US, neither had joined PEARL yet. That might be on the verge of changing if they are included in the 16+ countries Rutte mentioned. Concerning the original 6 contributors Ruta spoke of, we have already mentioned Germany. Past participants in Pearl also include the Netherlands, which pioneered the program by contributing $578 million for the initial Pearl package. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway pooled their resources to provide $495 million for the second package. The third package was Germany's $500 million, and Canada completed the original 6 with its own $500 million contribution. That amounts to just over $2 billion from 6 countries. Now, with nearly 3 times that number of nations in the Pearl program, Ukraine is surely hoping for billions more. The U.S., of course, is involved with Pearl by providing the weapons bought through the program. It does not appear, however, to have contributed its own funds to purchase those weapons, at least not within the program structure. U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, who held the title of Defense Secretary before a department rebranding, has also hinted that the growth of Pearl could have major implications for the war in Ukraine. Our expectation today is that more countries donate even more, that they purchase even more to provide for Ukraine, to bring that conflict to a peaceful conclusion, Hegseth stated, as reported by Newsweek. This appears to be consistent with the peace through strength doctrine that Hegseth often advocates for. Should the expanded Pearl succeed, a great deal of power is about to be transferred to Ukraine. This brings us to the question of what systems Ukraine will likely acquire with the help of Pearl's new funders. While there's no definite answer, we can infer based on the weapons Ukraine has previously stated it needs more of. We are aware that earlier Pearl funds allowed Ukraine to acquire interceptor missiles for its Patriot air defense systems, as well as missiles for its HIMARS. More funding might lead to further acquisitions of these missiles and their corresponding launch systems. But there are other armaments Ukraine requires. Denis Shmyhal, the country's defense minister, detailed these needs in a Facebook post on October 15th, following Ruta's announcement. Shmyhal thanked the new Pearl members and also spoke of air defense munitions for systems beyond the 2 just mentioned. This winter we will urgently need interceptors, air defense systems, and surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles for NASAMS, IRIS-T systems, F-16 aircraft, and more, the Ukrainian defense minister wrote. With winter just 6 weeks away, this comment may very well indicate where any fresh Pearl funds will be directed. Shmyhal also emphasized Ukraine's need for more investment in its expanding drone fleet and for as many artillery systems and shells as it can acquire. We continue to insist on a primary need of more than $4 billion. In 2026, we will be able to produce 20 million drones if partners provide the necessary funding. Our deep strike drones and missiles help us respond asymmetrically to Russian strikes, Shmyhal noted in his post. He makes a compelling point. Ukraine's drone manufacturing capacity is not the same as its current annual production. Ukraine is capable of building more than it currently does, but lacks the necessary funding. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made a similar remark back in June. Business Insider reported that Zelensky is confident his nation could manufacture 8 million drones a year if it secured additional financing. There is a discrepancy in the figures here. Zelensky mentions 8 million annually, whereas Shmyhal cites 20 million. However, Ukraine's defense minister doesn't specify an annual rate for the 20 million, so he might be referring to a multi-year production total. Regardless, the core message remains the same. Pearl could enable Ukraine to produce more drones, possibly with American assistance. On the subject of artillery, Shmyhal simply says that Ukraine requires more long-range artillery shells. As a noteworthy addendum to his remarks, Ukraine's defense minister added that the country's European allies have other avenues to help outside of Pearl, and these contributions could be crucial for aiding Ukraine. We ask partners to join us in covering $60 billion, half of planned spending. The optimal way is for European partners to allocate at least 0.25% of GDP to military assistance for Ukraine. Another option is a loan financed from Russia's frozen assets, Shmyhal said, concluding his post by once again thanking the NATO countries that have joined Pearl. To some, this final plea might seem excessive. Yet it's logical when considering Ukraine's efforts to expand its domestic defense industry. As of September, domestically produced weapons accounted for nearly 60% of those used by Ukraine in its war with Russia. Such production levels demand significant investment, in addition to expenditures on soldiers and other gear. Schmeichel may be urging NATO's European members to think long-term. Supporting Ukraine's expanding defense budget now could be viewed as an investment. If Ukraine prevails against Russia, it will be partly due to a much stronger defense industry, which could then supply its European allies in the years following the conflict. The strategy is to invest now to defeat Russia and reap the benefits of a more robust collective defense against future Russian aggression. There is one particular Pearl weapon we have not yet discussed. It's a weapon that has been on many people's minds, with numerous hints that the U.S. might supply it to Ukraine as a consequence of Putin's refusal to accept peace terms. RBC Ukraine reports it's a weapon on which Trump has stated a decision has essentially been made. It is also a weapon that prompted the Kremlin to declare its introduction to the Ukraine war would be a major blow to U.S.-Russia relations. That weapon is Tomahawk missiles. As a U.S.-made weapon, Ukraine could, in theory, buy these missiles through the Pearl program, provided the U.S. grants permission. As of now, a final decision has not been announced, but there is a quiet confidence in some circles that the U.S. will give the go-ahead. In public, Trump's statements have been full of maybes and I may. But if RBC Ukraine's report is accurate, the choice is all but made, and Russia's reaction, along with Zelensky's comments that the Tomahawk's arrival would force Russia to sober up, indicates the decision has favored Ukraine. If that's the case, Tomahawks could be a decisive factor, particularly in boosting the effectiveness of Ukraine's long-range strikes against Russia's energy infrastructure. The BBC reports that these potent missiles have a range of up to 1,500 miles. This would place Moscow within striking distance, should Ukraine choose to target the Russian capital directly. They are also versatile missiles, launchable from ships, submarines, or land, though the first two are likely not options for Ukraine due to its limited naval power. Nevertheless, at a cost of roughly $2.5 million per missile for the latest model, according to the New York Times, Tomahawks would be a feasible purchase under Pearl, especially with the program now boasting over 16 members. We must wait to see what the U.S. ultimately decides regarding these missiles. But even if Ukraine does not receive more Tomahawks, Rutte's announcement signifies it has achieved something it has desired since Pearl's inception: more participants. Just hours before the NATO-Ukraine Council, where the new Pearl members were announced, the Kiev Post reported that Rutte planned to urge NATO allies to join the initiative at the meeting. And one of the issues we'll be discussing is this new program which we launched only in August, the program where the United States is again delivering essential, lethal and non-lethal military support to Ukraine paid for by allies already $2 billion committed, Rutte said leading up to the council. And I have every reason to assume today that many other countries will sign up. Rutte's assumption was correct. Pearl now includes more than 16 contributors, and it's highly likely that other NATO members will join when they can. If Europe's major powers, like France and the UK, lend their support to the initiative, Russia will be deeply concerned. It might not even withstand what follows. Let's now examine the implications of all this for the war in Ukraine. Pearl's expansion is excellent news for Ukraine, because the program's very existence resolves the issues Trump and his administration have recently had with NATO. It was, after all, during Trump's 2018 visit to the NATO summit in Brussels that the U.S. president made his disapproval of NATO's management at the time abundantly clear. As Politico reports, Trump's first term was marked by threats to pull the U.S. out of NATO entirely, unless other members increased their spending on collective defense. Trump had a valid point. Even in 2025, the U.S. is still NATO's top defense spender. The gap between its spending and that of the rest of NATO was enormous until very recently. A July 2024 article from the Atlantic Council highlights this, showing that just a year before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, hardly any of NATO's members were meeting the organization's 2% of GDP defense spending target. Only Poland, the U.S., Greece, and Latvia were at or above the 2% threshold, with Lithuania close behind. Everyone else fell far short, and Trump was not pleased. Trump's push for increased NATO spending carried into his second term, which started in 2025. By then, the Atlantic Council noted that 23 of NATO's members were meeting or surpassing the 2% of GDP target. But Trump demanded more, and he succeeded. As of August 27th, NATO has officially declared a new target: 5% of each member's GDP committed to defense. With the U.S. under Trump now seemingly content with the fairness of NATO spending, it appears more willing to cooperate with the organization to support Ukraine again. Pearl is the most visible manifestation of this cooperation. For Putin, the U.S. returning to the NATO fold is disastrous news. For a large part of 2025, Putin seemed to think he could create division within NATO to the extent that the organization would become irrelevant in Ukraine. Cultivating a closer bond with the U.S. seemed to be part of his strategy, which might have allowed Putin to influence Trump and persuade him that leaving NATO was a good idea. But Putin miscalculated in peace talks, and Rutte's recent announcement demonstrates that NATO is now united against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. As an individual nation, the U.S. also appears to be backing Ukraine to a degree not seen at any other time during Trump's second presidency. In the last few months, Trump has been issuing threats of sanctions against Russia, though he has not yet acted on them. The Tomahawk missile issue mentioned earlier is another case of the U.S. leveraging its significant power to try to bring Putin back to the negotiating table. The U.S. is aware that Russia does not want Ukraine to possess Tomahawk missiles, and is using this as a bargaining chip. America's threats toward Russia, which in turn means support for Ukraine, were being made on the very day Rutte announced the Pearl expansion. In the same address where he endorsed Pearl and urged NATO's European members to increase spending, Hegseth stated that the U.S. was ready to impose costs on Russia for its continued aggression if the war in Ukraine does not cease. All of this must be a welcome development for Ukraine. Having such direct U.S. support, formalized in a program like Pearl, means Ukraine no longer needs to be concerned about the turbulent relationship with America that defined the first half of 2025. However, challenges remain. Some will argue that Pearl is a program that benefits the U.S., even while it aids Ukraine. To some degree, they would be correct. Through Pearl, the U.S. is effectively being paid by Ukraine's European allies to send weapons to Ukraine. This serves as a compromise, allowing the U.S. to provide the advanced weaponry Russia fears most without having to finance it directly. It seems like a very advantageous arrangement for the U.S. and for NATO. It is at least an arrangement that reinforces the bond between its members and a country that once appeared close to leaving the alliance. The other problem is that, even with Pearl, Ukraine requires more funding. Schmeichel made this evident in his Facebook post, and it is a reality that Ukraine received less military aid this summer than at any other time in 2025. The Kiel Institute, which monitors aid to Ukraine, emphasized this in an October 14th article. It reported a sharp 43% drop in military aid during July and August compared to the first 6 months of 2025. Civilian aid, the institute says, remains high. A potential reason for this is that Europe's NATO members have depleted their reserve equipment stockpiles, making it more difficult to provide aid while also trying to preserve their own military strength. Regardless of the cause, military aid has decreased. Pearl will help to mitigate this problem. And with over 16 contributing nations, Ukraine can look forward to a future where the specific U.S. weapons it needs to confront Russia are finally within reach. None of this has transpired as Putin had planned. But what is proceeding according to plan, at least from the Kremlin's perspective, are the devastating losses Russia is incurring in Ukraine. Discover what those losses are and why Russia appears so willing to endure them in our next video. And if you found this video informative, be sure to subscribe to Warzone Party for more analysis of NATO's latest actions against Russia.